The story of the American Civil War begins long before the first shot was fired, because wars never just appear out of thin air. They build slowly, and by the time 1861 arrived, the country was already split in every way that mattered. The North was racing into an industrial future with railroad, factories, and booming cities, while the South depended almost entirely on cotton, kept alive by the forced labor of 4 million enslaved people. The fight was never just about money or crops. It was about power, morality, and who had the right to define what America was supposed to be. Every time a new territory joined the Union, the same question lit a fire under the country. Would it enter as a free state or as a slave state? Whoever won those battles controlled Congress and in many ways the future. For decades, politicians tried to patch the growing divide with quick fixes like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, but it was like covering a cracked dam with tape. 'Cause unlike most presidents before him, Abraham Lincoln wasn't born sipping tea on fine china. He came from the dirt, literally. He grew up in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky. His mother died when he was 9, and he had less than a year of schooling. But Lincoln had something you just can't teach: grit, because after a full day of chopping wood, he taught himself law. And by the time he stepped into politics, people called him Honest Abe, a lawyer that actually stood by his word. In fact, Abe once walked miles to return 6 cents of change to a customer he accidentally overcharged. That's the kind of guy this dude was, a man of character. But what made Lincoln so dangerous to the South is that he opposed the expansion of slavery. 'Cause when he got elected president without a single Southern state, it was basically game over for the South. And South Carolina didn't wait around for the welcome speech, 'cause before Lincoln could even unpack his bags, they seceded from the Union. And within weeks, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, who all got together and formed a brand new nation, the Confederate States of America. But Lincoln didn't jump the gun and invade the South. Instead, it all started with an island fortress off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Sumter, one of the last Union outposts in Confederate territory. The problem? Both sides claimed it. So Lincoln faced an impossible choice. If he sent supplies, the South would call it an invasion. If he abandoned the fort, the North would see him as weak. So he chose a middle path and sent only food. No guns, no ammo, just bread, beans, and the hope that the Confederates would just look the other way. My man was basically trying to deliver DoorDash to avoid the Civil War. But unfortunately, the South wasn't hungry for compromise, 'cause Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard gave the order: open fire. And for 34 straight hours, cannons thundered across Charleston Harbor. Yet somehow, miraculously, no one died. Ouch. But when the Union commander surrendered, the message echoed across the nation. War had begun. So Lincoln didn't waste a second and called for 75,000 volunteers to crush the rebellion, which ironically poured more fuel on the fire because 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. Sir, I think that backfired. But Virginia was the big one, the crown jewel. Because its secession didn't just double the Confederacy's size, it delivered their greatest military weapon, Robert E. Lee, the son of a Revolutionary War hero, a West Point graduate who finished second in his class, and a decorated veteran of the Mexican-American War. Believe it or not, when the Union needed a commander, Lincoln actually offered Lee the job, but he turned it down. And not for the reason you might think, 'cause Lee opposed secession and even called slavery a moral and political evil. But when Virginia left the Union, Lee faced his own impossible choice: fight against his country or fight against his home. And he sided with Virginia, gifting the Confederacy one of the sharpest military minds in history. But here's the crazy part. Both sides assumed the war would be over pretty quick. 'Cause when Union troops marched toward Virginia, the mood was almost festive. People from DC actually packed picnic baskets and rode out in carriages to watch the battle. Anyone has some popcorn? Ooh, don't mind if I do. But the good vibes didn't last long, because the Battle of Bull Run began with the two armies colliding. And at first, the Union pushed the Confederates back. But when Brigadier General Thomas Jackson arrived with his brigade, the Confederates rallied. One Confederate officer even pointed and shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." And the nickname stuck. Stonewall Jackson had arrived, allowing the Confederates to regroup and counterattack, where they broke the Union line and forced them to retreat in a full-blown panic. And it was so chaotic, civilian carriages were bumping into Union troops in the rush to get home. "Hey, wait up! Can somebody give me a ride?" But this was only the beginning, because 1862 would unleash a level of violence America had never seen before. Down in Tennessee, a quiet cigar-chewing Union general named Ulysses S was making his move. He captured Fort Henry, then Fort Donald Elson. And when the Confederate commander asked for surrender terms, Grant replied with the line that made him famous: "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." Translation: "I'm not here to negotiate, I'm here to win." But Grant's real test came at a place called Shiloh, where Confederate forces launched a surprise attack and Union lines buckled. But Grant didn't panic. He never panicked. That night, reinforcements arrived. And at sunrise, Grant counterattacked and hard, 'cause by the end of day 2, the Confederates were the ones retreating. A close call, right? Well, not exactly, because when the smoke cleared, it revealed over 23,000 casualties, more than all previous American wars combined. I just can't believe it. So, with war heating up, Lincoln desperately needed someone to lead his main army. And in comes General George McClellan. Young, brilliant, and a guy convinced he was Napoleon 2.0. But McClellan's confidence came with a fatal flaw. He hated taking risks. If the stars weren't aligned, the weather wasn't perfect, and the odds were 110% in his favor, he just wouldn't attack. "Get back in line, Flappy." "Sorry, sir." Meanwhile, Lincoln was losing his patience. He sent McClellan a note saying, "If you don't want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." Ouch. So McClellan finally launched the Peninsula Campaign, a massive push to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. And for a moment, it looked like the crazy kid might pull it off. Union troops got so close they could hear Richmond's church bells ringing. But that's when everything changed, because a new commander took charge of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee. And oh boy, did he not waste a moment, because Lee went straight on the attack and hammered McClellan's army. Mud, bayonets, forest on fire. It was straight up madness. Yet in the end, Lee actually lost more men than McClellan, but he didn't care. He'd achieved exactly what he wanted. The Union army pushed away from Richmond, and McClellan's confidence was shattered. And shattered is the perfect way to put it, because McClellan walked away convinced he'd been outnumbered, outmatched, and crushed by some massive Confederate force. But in reality, Lee's army was smaller. So, riding high from his victories, Lee made a bold move and took the war into the north by invading Maryland. But that's when fate dropped a plot twist so crazy, Miss Flappy thought I was literally making this up. But I'm not. I swear. Because a Union soldier stumbled across an abandoned Confederate campsite and found a copy of Lee's battle plan. There it was, the full blueprint. McClellan literally held the Confederacy's playbook in his hands, So, with this new advantage up against Lee's tactical genius, we finally got ourselves a fair fight. And what came next was the bloodiest day in American history, the Battle of Antietam, where Union troops surged into a cornfield and faced a storm of lead. Men charged, fell down, and charged again. Bodies dropped everywhere, and one soldier later said a man could walk from one end of the field to the other without ever touching the ground. Horrifying. But just when you thought the battle couldn't get worse, it moved to Bloody Lane, a sunken road where Confederates packed in and mowed down wave after wave of Union soldiers charging straight into the rifles. Eventually, Union troops flanked the road and fired downward into the trapped Confederates below, creating a mass grave carved into the earth. But the final push came at Antietam Creek, where Union forces crossed the bridge to finish Lee's army for good. Until out of nowhere, surprise reinforcements appeared and forced the Union back. The cornfield changed hands 15 times, and Bloody Lane stacked 3 deep. And when the sun finally set, there were more than 23,000 casualties. The single bloodiest day in American history was over. And on paper, Antietam was a draw, but strategically, the Union forced Lee to retreat. Sir, I'll be flying the flag at half-mast for the next decade because that was just devastating. But back in D.C., Lincoln wanted to use this momentum to his advantage. So he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves are, and henceforward shall be free. Woohoo! Well, the only problem was it didn't actually free anyone in Confederate states yet. But it did give Union soldiers a moral cause worth fighting for. It allowed black men to enlist with the nearly 200,000 answering the call and shut the door on European intervention because Britain and France could no longer side with the Confederacy without openly defending slavery. Yep, Lincoln had officially changed the game. But he had another big problem on his hands. A general problem. Because Robert E. Lee was on the move again, this time marching 75,000 men into Pennsylvania. And Lincoln was desperate for a commander who could finally stop him. So he made another change at the top and replaced his general with George Meade just 3 days before battle. Meade wasn't a genius, but he was solid, calm under pressure, and the kind of guy who wouldn't panic if I misfired my gun. Sorry, sir. But it all kicked off when Confederate and Union forces collided near a quiet little town called Gettysburg. And by nightfall, the Confederates had the upper hand. But on day 2, the battle didn't just continue. It erupted into chaos. Casey launched massive assaults on both Union flanks, and one of the fiercest attacks came at Little Round Top, a rocky hill that anchored the entire Union line. If it fell, the battle, and maybe even the war, could have been lost. But that's when Colonel Joshua Chamberlain in his 20th Maine made a heroic stand. Outnumbered and out of ammunition, Chamberlain had nothing left to shoot. So he ordered one final desperate move, a bayonet charge downhill, and against all odds, it worked. Meanwhile, on the other flank, Confederate forces stormed Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill as night fell. The fighting devolved into ruthless hand-to-hand combat in the dark, but again, the Union refused to break. Lee had thrown everything at Meade's flanks and failed. Enraged, Lee made a fateful decision: attack the center. So on day 3, Confederate artillery unleashed the largest bombardment ever seen in the Western Hemisphere. Cannons thundered, the earth trembled, and the sky turned to smoke so thick it swallowed the sun. And then shits. Out of the drifting haze, 12,000 Confederate soldiers emerged and began their march. Pickett's charge. The last gamble. So the Union line waited and then unleashed a storm of bullets. Men fell by the hundreds, but still the Gray Line pushed forward, and somehow a few hundred Confederates actually broke through. Led by General Lewis Armistead, they reached the Union guns, and in an effort to flip the battle, Armistead placed his hand on a Union cannon and shouted for his men to fire the enemy cannons back at him. But little did he know, this was the furthest any Confederate would ever get on Northern soil. Because when Armistead turned around, he was completely alone. Bang! The charge had failed. Of the 12,000 men who began that march, less than half returned uninjured. And when Lee rode out to meet the survivors, tears streamed down his face. "It's all my fault," he quietly said to himself. "It's all my fault." The Battle of Gettysburg proved to be the deadliest of the Civil War, resulting 50,000 casualties total. But while Gettysburg shook the East, another battle was roaring 900 meters away. Because General Ulysses S had spent months trying and failing to capture Vicksburg, the last Confederate fortress on the Mississippi River. So, he decided to change it up and do something borderline insane. At 2 a.m., Grant rolled the dice and sent Union gunboats right past Vicksburg's cannons, fully aware that if even one was hit, the whole plan would collapse. But it was so dark, the cannons couldn't see a thing, and the boats slid right past him, allowing Grant to finally tighten his grip around Vicksburg. Because inside, Confederate soldiers ran out of food. They ate mules, dogs, and eventually rats. "Hey boys, maybe stay away from the eagles." "All right, ready please?" But by July 4th, 1863, the Confederates in Vicksburg surrendered. Now with Gettysburg in the east and Vicksburg in the west, the war had officially turned. Because now it was clear as day. Lincoln had finally found his general, Ulysses S, who he promoted to command all Union armies. And Grant wasted no time setting his strategy. In the west, he handed command to William Sherman with the order, destroy the Confederate army in Georgia and take Atlanta. Meanwhile, in the east, Grant set his own sights on Robert E. Lee, and they both locked horns in a bloodbath across Virginia. First, at the Wilderness. They fought in a thick forest with guns and smoke, so thick soldiers could barely see in front of them. And after 2 days of combat, Grant's losses were enormous. Every Union general before him had retreated after facing Lee, but not Grant. He marched south, still attacking, still pushing, and still grinding Lee down. At Spot, bodies piled so high they had to be dragged away just to keep fighting. One oak tree, 2 feet thick, was cut down by rifle fire alone. Then came Cold Harbor, where Grant ordered an assault turned disaster because more than 7,000 Union soldiers fell in less than an hour. Grant later admitted it was the one attack he truly regretted. But here's one thing Lee couldn't do: stop him. Because every time Grant lost men, he replaced them. And every time Lee lost men, he didn't get them back. So by the Siege of Petersburg, the fighting dragged on for 9 brutal months. Lee's army was pinned down, starving and cut off. And at the same time, Northern newspapers called Grant the Butcher for wasting tens of thousands of Union lives. But Lincoln understood what others didn't. I can't spare this man. He fights. In other words, Grant is the first general willing to do what it actually takes to win. Meanwhile, in the West, General Sherman took things in a, let's call it a unique direction, because he believed in something called total war, which means not just defeating the enemy, but breaking their will to fight. War is cruelty. There's no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it'll be over. So throughout the summer of 1864, Sherman pushed toward Atlanta, and by September, it fell. Afterwards, Sherman sent a simple telegram to Lincoln. Atlanta is ours, and fairly won, and the timing couldn't have been better, because Lincoln faced re-election in November and things weren't looking too good. War fatigue was high, casualties were staggering, and public confidence was slipping away. But when Sherman achieved victory in Atlanta, everything changed. Lincoln won re-election in a landslide, Woohoo! But wait, the war wasn't over yet, and Sherman knew it. So instead of stopping in Atlanta, he proposed something radical. March across Georgia to the Atlantic and destroy everything of military value along the way. I can make this march, Sherman told Grant, and make Georgia howl. Grant approved and unleashed him. So Sherman set Atlanta ablaze and began his legendary march to the sea, where 60,000 soldiers moved in 2 massive columns 60 mid wide. They ripped up railroads, burned factories, and everywhere they went, liberated slaves. With thousands joining the march, singing songs of freedom, and by the time Sherman reached Savannah, his army had carved a path of destruction nearly 300 meters long. He sent Lincoln a telegram that simply read, "I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah." By 1865, the Confederacy was on life support. Lee's army was starving. Men were deserting and ammunition was almost gone. When Union forces broke through at Five Forks and severed Lee's last supply line, within days Petersburg fell, then Richmond. As Confederate officials fled the capital, they set fire to their own warehouses to keep supplies from falling out into Union hands. But the flames raged out of control, burning Richmond to the ground. Lee fled west with 30,000 starving men, but Grant was everywhere. He cut off every road, bridge, and hope of escape. It was the end. Lee was completely surrounded. So with no options left, Lee asked for a meeting with Grant, and they met at Appomattox Courthouse. The contrast between the two generals couldn't have been more stark. Grant arrived in a mud-stained uniform, looking like a soldier who hadn't slept in days. Whereas Lee wore his finest dress uniform, every button polished to a shine. He was sending a message. "I may be defeated, but I'll surrender with dignity." And Grant offered pretty generous terms. Confederate soldiers could keep their horses, officers could keep their sidearms, and every man would be paroled and allowed to go home. No executions, no treason trials, no revenge. Lee's face softened. "This will have a very happy effect on my army," he said quietly. Lee then asked if Grant could spare rations. Grant nodded. "Certainly." "How many men?" "About 25,000. Without hesitation, Grant sent 25,000 rations to Lee's starving soldiers. And when the meeting ended, the two men shook hands. But then came one of the most human moments of the entire war, because Lee mounted his horse and rode back to his army, where soldiers crowded around, reaching for his hand, as tears streaked down their faces. Lee couldn't speak. He simply removed his hat and salute. The Civil War, America's deadliest conflict, was finally over. But there was one final tragedy no one expected. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater, where Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. But it wasn't just Lincoln's tragic death that makes it so sad. It was the timing. Abraham Lincoln guided America through its darkest hour, preserved the Union, and struck the chains of slavery from 4 million people, only to die just before he could see the promised land. "We'll miss you, sir, but in the end, the American Civil War didn't just change America, it defined it. Because over 600,000 Americans died, more than all other American wars combined until Vietnam, which is insane to think about. But from its ashes, the United States was given a second chance. A chance to live up to the founders' ideals that all men are created equal. God bless America, man. I freaking love this place." But speaking of tragic presidential deaths that changed the course of America, this is how every US president died and their final words. From eating raw cherries to contaminated water at the White House to getting assassinated in broad daylight. If you thought Lincoln's death was crazy, just click this video right here and subscribe.